Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Shai Cohen, a faculty member here at the University of Miami, and I'm delighted to have you all here at this event tonight. Before we dive into tonight's discussion on the latest developments on the Israel-Palestine conflict and the Israel-Hamas War, I'd like to remind you that there's also an important talk here tomorrow night, hosted here in Hillel at 6 here in the same building. So please also come to show your support. A big thanks to Brianna from Hillel, the director of Hillel, and Hillel International for sponsoring this event and providing us with this venue. There was supposed to be already at 6 o'clock over there, the pizza, but still not here. This is Miami, so we're going to have it later instead of before, which is good. Well, I also want to thank Daniel Goldman for setting up this position, for putting us in contact. And it is fantastic to see all of you here. And also, of course, warm welcome to the ones that are somehow on the cloud, virtually joining us. Also, for the people on Zoom, please feel free to join us in the Q&A later by writing or, of course, by just speaking, old-fashioned way. So I want to first start by expressing our heartfelt support for the recently released hostages, for about 50 of them. And we wish them all a swift recovery and a quick return to the routine we sometimes fear in times of peace, but definitely desire in times of war. Additionally, our thoughts, of course, and prayers are with the other 178 hostages that are currently still in the hands of Hamas. So we'll commence with a little bit of the program for tonight. We'll start with about 10, 15, 20 minutes of for each speaker. Subsequently, there will be a 20 minutes moderated talk with some questions, premeditated questions. And later, we'll open the floor for Q&A, for all of you to participate as well. Now it's my great privilege to introduce our distinguished speakers for tonight's event, for joining us from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, with a noble goal to foster a nuanced and practical comprehension of American interests in the Middle East and advocate for the implementation of policies that safeguard those interests. David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Correct Project on Arab-Israel Relations. He's also the Adjunct Professor in the Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University, at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. From 2013 to 2014, he worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian negotiations. He has written 3 books, 2 co-authors with Ambassador Dennis Ross, and he's the host of Decision Point podcast, which examines Israeli history and U.S.-Israel relations. Joining him is Ghaith al-Omari from the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation, the Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute, Irving Levi Family Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. He's the former Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, served as advisor to the negotiating team during 1999 to 2001 permanent status talk, in addition to holding various other positions within the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, the combined expertise promises an insightful perspective on the core issues on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have no doubt their talk will be thoughtful, enlightening, and intellectually stimulating. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guests, Mr. Makovsky and Mr. al-Omari. Gentlemen.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me in the back okay? All right. Thank you very much, Shai, for hosting us here. Ghaith and I have done, I don't know, we've done about 70 campus visits together. So I'm going to condense a lot. My PowerPoint here just to make sure that I don't step onto Raith's time. And then I look forward to the discussion, the Q&A with you guys. I just thought for those people who don't know exactly where Gaza is, right? It's right there, right at that like south west corner of Israel. The northern Sinai of Egypt is right there. And I thought it might be useful to just give like a quick kind of history. There's a kind of a closer view. So what I thought I'll do is I'll try to just really cover 2 points with some depth, and hopefully make it interesting for you guys, and just try to give you a sense of like, what the heck's going on over there? How do we get to this point? What's the history in particular? And what are the policy objectives of the United States and Israel? Do they converge? Do they diverge? So a little bit of the history, a little bit of the here and now, and Raith's going to talk to you about Hamas and the day after, assuming Israel is successful. So look, Gaza was a place that when Israel was born in 1948, some Palestinian refugees from where would be today Israel went there. And it was a friction point because there were infiltrations in the 50s and the like, but it was basically run by Egypt. Egypt administered the area between 48 and 67. Israel briefly won Gaza in 56. Eisenhower said, I think you should give it back, and Israel did. In 67, there was another war. Many of you have heard of it, the Six-Day War. And here Israel won on all fronts. Won the Golan Heights in the north, won the West Bank and critically East Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, to the west, and it won the Sinai Desert in the south, and also won Gaza. But Gaza was something that, in many ways, that was something Israel didn't really want to win. And during Camp David Accords, the first treaty between Israel and an Arab country was, Egypt. Israel said, hey, why don't you, buy one, get one free, like Israel's giving back the Sinai, why don't you take Gaza too? And the Egyptians said, no, thank you. It became seen by Egypt as like political quicksand. Didn't want to touch it. Israel didn't see strategic value. It didn't have political, I would say, biblical patrimony. The West Bank was like walking in the footsteps of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, patriarchs, the matriarchs. And here, Gaza, while, you'll always find some rabbinic source that says it is part of the land of Israel, most people think it is not. Now, Israel had 8,500 settlers in Gaza. Now there's about 2.2 million people there. When the Oslo talks happened, what is Oslo? There's a piece in the cover of the New York Times Magazine this week, and talks about it. Oslo was the secret talks in Norway in '93 that tried to say, okay, the Zionist movement, the Palestinian movement, we haven't met. Israel would say, hey, you had an opportunity with the UN partition plan of 47, two-state solution, you take half, you take half. The Zionist movement was willing to take half, but the Arab side felt the Jews are not legitimate. They don't deserve half a loaf. And that started the 48 war, the day Israel was born, and the like. By 93, and there was an effort to try to say, okay, maybe we could find a way to compromise here. And this was not easy for either side, because the Palestinians saw Israel as illegitimate. Israel saw the PLO, as it was called, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, viewed him as an arch terrorist for different things that he did at different times, or different people did things under his aegis, so to speak, under his rubric. But they said, okay, let's try to find it out. Now, we can't agree on everything. It's too difficult. Jerusalem's very tough. Refugees are very tough. Let's start down this road. Rafe doesn't like when I, bring in sports analogies, but let's hit some singles and doubles. We can't solve it all. Let's try to do what we could do. I wrote a book on this talk, on the secret talks in Oslo. And basically, one of the first things they did agree on was Gaza. Israel said, listen, it's yours. Congratulations. Israel will get out of Gaza. And then I was there at the White House ceremony when Clinton engineered that famous iconic handshake of Rabin and Arafat. And then within May of 94, I was in Cairo when they announced Gaza Jericho. The first implementation of the handshake is Gaza. Palestinians, you run it. And so Israel, starts pulling away from Gaza in 94, but the settlers are still there. Now, people said their hope was that the whole issue would be solved by 2000, and then by 2005, after what was called the Second Intifada, the Second Uprising, where Hamas was very dominant, Israel pulled its settlers out, 8,500 settlers. This wasn't easy because Ariel Sharon was the architect of the settlement movement going back to the 70s. Now, in the 70s, before the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty of 79, Sharon thought that settlements would stop Egyptian tanks that would go up the Mediterranean coast en route to Tel Aviv. But once Israel had a peace treaty with Egypt, the settlements looked somewhat anachronistic. So he said, now I'm prime minister, then I was a cabinet minister, but now I'm the head of the government. Let's get out of Gaza. Let's just get out totally. And it'll be totally belong to Palestinians. And that was 2005. Now, Palestinians had elections in 2006. That was the last set of elections. Mahmoud Abbas ran presidential elections in 2005, parliamentary elections 2006. The joke is that Abbas is in, like the 18th year of a 5-year term, which is true. But in 2007, Abbas and Hamas, and you'll hear more about Hamas from Ray, but basically there was the belief that Hamas said, listen, we don't want to have a coalition government with Abbas in the West Bank. You run the West Bank, we'll run Gaza. And they actually literally threw Palestinians, not Israelis, by the way, Palestinians like off rooftops of hospitals. Abbas's mainstream Palestinian Authority, which is based in Ramallah in the West Bank, was literally kicked out of Gaza. Now, since 2007, I'm bringing you this as backdrop, Israel realized, oh my God, stuck with Hamas, but Hamas says, hey, we're going to keep firing rockets at you guys. But Israel would say, yeah, but we're out. Well, you're out, but you're not fully out because you're on the airspace and offshore. And also, frankly, for us, you're not out till you're out of Jerusalem. And you're out, and we don't recognize you anywhere. We don't recognize you as a telephone, as a part of the size of a telephone booth on a Tel Aviv beach. And we're going to keep firing at you. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. Then Israel kind of strengthened, like what some people call blockade, to say, hey, we're not going to allow you to bring in rockets to fire at us. We have a Navy and we're going to stop that. And that certainly, but there's a cause and there's an effect. That it wasn't that the blockade led to this, it was the result of Hamas taking over in 2007. Now, since then, there were all sorts of ideas to say, maybe look, Hamas has got to govern too, and maybe they're not as ideological. 2007 is already a while back by now, as we were zooming out here. Maybe you can more carrots, less sticks, more carrots. Bring workers in. If you have workers, you give people skin in the game. They've got some hope. They'd be earning in Israel 9 times what they would be earning in Gaza. And that became certainly the view of the Bennett-Lapid government, and it remained under this government. So 17,000 workers. Clearly, people thought it wasn't enough. We should do more. But first, let's see if that succeeds. There was some suspicions, though. They said, like, Hamas, are they going to allow people to work? That's like going to create an independent power base from them. They want everyone kind of eating out of the hands of Hamas. Now they'll have their own income sources. And sadly, and I say this, great tragedy, I was one of those who was hopeful that maybe you could take the edge off of Hamas's ideology a bit by giving people a stake in success, to give people some hope you could give them a job. Now, it turns out, and I'm not saying 17,000 of these people were Hamas agents, but the intel material that's been discovered on the Palestinians who went into all these different kibbutzim, they knew where the children's houses were in the different kibbutzim, what family had a dog, what family didn't have a dog. They knew incredible intel, and it wasn't stuff they got from Google Earth, where these people squeezed to say, hey man, you want a job? Like, we know you're earning 9 times what every other Gazan's earning, and we know where your kids go to school. You want to keep working? Fine, but you got to give us some intel on where you're working. What's it like? Tell us who lives where. And so that is, I think, added to the trauma in Israel, that they felt very violated, that these people who they invited into their communities, as they see it, turned on them. Now, again, they weren't necessarily the Hamas shooters, but they were working off their intel. But October 7th was the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust. Nothing can compare the Holocaust, of course, but 1,200 civilians in one day. You know, some of them burned alive, some raped, some beheaded. It was just horrific. And if the 4 rounds with Hamas until this war was, let's contain Hamas, let's just restore deterrence, they've done all this terrorist stuff, we got to hit back at that. That was 2008, end of 2008, early 2009. 2012, I was working for the Secretary of State's office in 2014. There was another round in 2021. All those 4 incidents, what they had in common was a belief that you couldn't topple Hamas. That was too big of an objective. What you could do is contain them, you could restore deterrence. Here, it's a fundamentally different objective. That's the other point I wanted to make to you, which was, this is an effort to actually topple them. To say, listen, we just can't live having, the United States under Barack Obama, I worked in the Obama administration, we could not have a situation of ISIS that was thousands of miles for us from our shores in America, behead our citizens, and we went to liberate ISIS. This is down the street from Israel. And each time Israel was hoping, well, maybe we don't got the right formula. Maybe we could tweak it. Maybe we could do more carrots. And I think this time Israel is going for broke. Israel's putting the bar way high to say, no, it's about toppling Hamas. You're not going to take Hamas as an idea out of the hearts and minds of people. You're not going to be able to go to every last Hamas member. You're not going to be able to find every last pistol. But what you want to do is to say is they have to be driven from power. There needs to be a post-Hamas Gaza that is more normal, like in the West Bank, something comparable. You might have disagreements, but it's something in the zone. There's no one there who says, I want to annihilate the state of Israel. Where does the president come in? The president has been incredibly supportive of Israel. Picture of him. Anyway, but all right, it doesn't matter. You know what President Biden looks like. But he, oh, there we go. Yeah. And, okay. Yeah, I got a lot more, but I'm just going to go quick. I'm going to take the time. President has said a few things. President has said, listen, I'm with you. And he's really, I think, kind of made a visceral connection with the people of Israel. I'm with you because I have empathy for all that you've been suffering. He likes to talk about his own personal suffering, the loss of his wife, the loss of his baby when he was a young senator from Delaware. I can speak with moral clarity, not just empathy. I know this is unadulterated evil. I know that even ISIS wouldn't do some of these terrible beheadings of babies and things like that, and burning people alive and raping them this way. So I think the sense of empathy, a sense of moral clarity, I think a sense of I got to back up words and deeds with deeds. This is a new thing for Israel. Israel's always felt defend ourselves by ourselves, belief, give us the weapons, we'll do the job. We don't want any American dying for Israel, has been the way Israelis talk. But now there's rockets that could come from Houthi rebels in Yemen. It's a new world. It's not your father or mother's Middle East anymore. You could have a cruise missile from Lebanon, from an Iranian militia in Syria. And so we're going to send aircraft carriers, the Gerald R. Ford, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, and we're going to intercept incoming rockets. And it's going to be a message. We don't want to regionalize this conflict. We don't want Iran to light up the Middle East. We want to localize the conflict. We want Israel to do what Israel has to do to topple Hamas. And I think Biden has also been persuasive with Israelis in saying, your success is connected to humanitarian provisions. You want more time on the proverbial clock of a sporting match? You got to do more on the humanitarian side. Israel would say, look, 1 million people from the north have been directed to the south. We just want them out of harm's way. And now we're at halftime, so to speak, of this game. That is the pauses with the release of the hostages, of some of them, of the 50 Israelis and another, I think 20 or so foreign hostages. And now is going to be the hard part, which is the South, because you've told 1 million people to get out of the North, to get out of harm's way, so they're so not hurt. And now you might be coming to this, you're coming to the South, but now there's 2 million people in the South, and you can't tell the people in the South now go to the North to get out of harm's way. So it's a real challenge. And so I would say that what's amazing is to see the convergence between American and Israeli objectives in terms of toppling Hamas. Israel kind of coming along with Biden on the more humanitarian assistance, trucks, food, water, and things like that. And even fuel is something that Israel has understood as something that is good for Israel to help it achieve its goals, to give more time on the clock. The last half sentence I would just say is sometimes the news is not always what's said, it's what isn't said. And I think there are a lot of people rooting for Hamas, rooting for Israel to topple Hamas. And that's the Arab leaders, because they all see Hamas as destabilizing. Sometimes they have public opinion, and Al Jazeera is, an Arab satellite channel that's very, I'm sorry to say, anti-American. We appear on a lot of Arab satellite channels. Jazeera is in its own class as being pro-Hamas. And so it has whipped up a lot of Arab sentiment. But I think what's happened is that the Arab leaders are quietly saying these guys are destabilizing. And, you start with Hamas or go to al-Qaeda and ISIS. We want Israel to succeed, but we just can't say it. We just can't say it. It's too politically costly for us to say it. But I think when Biden said yesterday, all the nations, all the states, I don't think he's referring to the peoples, but the governor, the leaders, want Israel to end Hamas. And then there's the question of what comes next, but I've talked too long. So just the history I want to get at, the sense that there's a convergence between the US and Israel on objectives. And now I want to just turn over to my friend and colleague, al-Omari.
All right, thank you very much, David. Okay, can you hear me in the back? Great. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is also a bit of history in terms of what is Hamas, the history of Hamas from its founding until now, and then, as David said, what comes after the war is over. But before I do this, and that's going to be really a very policy-heavy presentation, I want to start by saying that this conflict, like every other conflict, there are many angles you can look at it. One angle to look at this conflict is obviously the human and humanitarian side of it. And I have to say, it's a tragedy for all involved. I mean, what happened on October 7th, there is no word to describe it but terror. David mentioned it. What we saw was unspeakable, and it was a tragedy for a small country where everyone knows everyone. Not a single Israeli that I know has not, everyone that I know has lost someone or knows someone who has lost someone. So that was tragic. And what we're seeing today in Gaza is tragic. Even if we say that the numbers that are coming out of the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is Hamas controlled, are inflated, the fact remains that civilians are dying who have nothing to do with the violence. So at some register, at the human register, you want to basically the war to end as soon as possible. But there's a more complicated register, and that is the policy register. And this is what I think we'll be focusing on right now. But enough to say that policy that is not aware of the human side of things will always remain deficient. But to the kind of body of my presentation, let me start with what is Hamas. You know, the Palestinian society, like every other society, has always had an Islamist component. If you look at any Arab society, you will see around 15, 20% of the population defined politically as Islamists, usually under the banner of what's called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that was created in Egypt in the 1920s, which basically calls for changing secular rule and secular law into Islamic law, ultimately leading to the creation of an Arab-wide caliphate of some sort. The Palestinians have always had their branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. By and large, until the 1980s, focused primarily on issues that relate to charity, to religious education, etc. By the late 1980s, in 1987, the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza in particular decided that they wanted to join the fight. And so they rebranded, created a new organization, called it Hamas. Hamas is the Arabic acronym for the Islamic Liberation, the Islamic Resistance Movement. Note that the word Palestine does not even appear in the name of Hamas, simply because they see themselves as part of a wider pan-Islamic, pan-Arab organization. Now, when Hamas was created in 1987, it was really seen by all involved as an irritant. It was not a major threat by anyone. So much so that the Israelis, while for sure they were not part of creating Hamas, looked at it as, you know what, we'll give them more space to operate. They will be a counterweight to the secular enemy at that time, which was the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Hamas struggled for a while until actually the Oslo Agreement was signed. Because when Oslo was signed, Hamas found its opportunity to basically distinguish itself from everyone else. And the Oslo Agreement basically entailed the PLO recognizing Israel and in effect recognizing the idea of a two-state solution and adopting diplomacy as a way of achieving this objective. Hamas said, okay, this is our moment to distinguish ourselves. And Hamas at that point came and said, no, we reject the whole premise. We believe as an organization that all of historic Palestine, i.e. from the river to the sea, a term that I'm sure you're hearing a lot these days, is Islamic endowment. It belongs to us and it have to be all liberated. And the way to do that is to use violence. And this is really not something that I'm kind of analyzing. You will see this actually in Hamas's charter written in very clear terms. Initially, when the Oslo Agreement was seen as promising, at the beginning, initial euphoria around the Oslo Agreement, Hamas actually was very unpopular. If you look at the polling coming from that period, Hamas was unpopular because it was seen by most Palestinians at that time as basically being a spoiler in a process that most Palestinians felt was going to actually lead to something. That was before Oslo basically crashed. Yet Hamas at that point was not very interested in popular appeal. It was interested in torpedoing that process. So what we saw during the 1990s and during my time as a negotiator in the late 90s and in the 2000s, every time that we saw progress in Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, Hamas will go blow up some bus, some cafe, some restaurant, some nightclub as a way of basically derailing this. It was most damaging and most spectacular after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Soon after that, Hamas embarked on a wave of bus bombings that basically changed the face of Israeli politics after that. But Hamas, as the 1990s proceeded, Hamas's popularity started to increase. And that was really based on two factors. One factor was the fact that the promise of diplomacy basically stalled. After the assassination of Rabin, we had Netanyahu become prime minister. Netanyahu was someone who was very explicit in saying, I'm against Oslo. So during his term, his first term in the 1990s, the peace process stalled. That accrued to the benefit of Hamas that said, you know what, we have no one to do business with on the Israeli side. You know, leave aside the fact that they were part of creating this phenomenon, yet they also benefited from that. But they also benefited from something else. In the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority, pursuant to Oslo, was created. The Palestinian Authority was supposed to be the body that is governing Palestinians as a temporary, as a provisional body step towards the creation of a Palestinian state. When the Palestinian Authority was created, it was created along the same model that existed elsewhere in the Arab world. The model of Egypt Mubarak, Tunisia's Ben Ali, all of that. The corrupt, inefficient model that ultimately brought us the Arab Spring. The Palestinian Authority was heavily involved in corruption. Public service and public jobs were seen less of as a tool of giving services to people, more of a tool of giving favors to your friends and those who you want to co-opt. So all of these things basically gave Hamas a bump in the polls, and it became more and more popular. Its popularity really skyrocketed after the year 2000, when we had the second Intifada. The second Intifada was came after the failure of the Camp David summit under Bill Clinton. And Hamas saw that as a moment to say, look, negotiations and diplomacy do nothing. Let's embark on violence. During that period, Hamas embarked on some of the most bloody, most spectacular terror attacks against Israel. After the Intifada ended and Arafat died, we had a new president. You mentioned him, David, Mahmoud Abbas. We refer to him as Abu Mazen, a guy that I worked for around 10 years. And Abbas basically wanted to cement his legitimacy by running an election. He won the presidential election, then he ran a parliamentary election. Hamas was very smart. They understood that after the Intifada, most Palestinians were too scarred by violence. So they did not run on a campaign about violence. They ran a campaign about good governance. They basically said, look at us pious people, we cannot possibly be as bad as those thieves in the Palestinian Authority. And basically they won those elections. As David said, there was a period of tension and ultimately culminated in a civil war in 2006, and Hamas won and took over Gaza. Since then, the Palestinian body politic has been divided between these two organizations, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Hamas in Gaza. And never that one shall meet for many reasons. I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A. Now, governing Gaza, initially when Hamas took over Gaza, there was, I think, a sense of maybe hope among the population of Gaza. Here we have people who are going to come and govern in a clean way. Yet Hamas governing Gaza proved to be as corrupt and as authoritarian as the Palestinian Authority. My favorite story, the son of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, had fertility issues, went to Qatar to get fertility treatment, came back with twins and a contract to build the soccer stadium. Obviously, the stadium was never built, and the guy bought a couple of new Mercedes and was living the life. So the same kind of corruption that we saw basically led most people in Gaza to really, despair is not the right word, to feel disgust towards Hamas. There was actually a poll that was conducted, that was concluded, I think 2 days before October 7th, that showed Hamas's popularity in Gaza really low in the kind of, I think, 30 percentile, if not worse than that. So, yet they don't govern Gaza by the consent of the governed, as it were. They govern Gaza by, if you don't like us, you get kneecapped or you get disappeared. This is kind of what Hamas is, and this is what led us to it. So anyone who tells you that Hamas did October 7th because they wanted, because of the failure of the peace process, I don't buy that. Hamas were never a believer in the peace process. Hamas intentionally and proactively went to and did everything they could to derail the peace process. Now, I'm not going to add much to what David said, just want to punctuate the point that the issue of Israel's objective of toppling Hamas is a very legitimate objective. No country should be expected to be subjected to what happened on October 7th and then do nothing about it. So the objective itself is legitimate. Yet Israel's ability to do that is very closely linked to its ability to demonstrate that it's doing everything possible to minimize civilian casualties and everything possible to deal with the humanitarian situation. Short of that, the international coalition supporting Israel, and here I would add to what you said about Biden, not only was he clear in supporting Israel's legitimate objective, he was also very skilled in building a coalition supporting that. By this time in previous wars, most European countries would have peeled off. Many of them today remain there. But if Israel fails to show respect and diligence when it comes to civilian issues, then this coalition will shatter, and ultimately Israel's diplomatic space will close. Now, what will happen the day after? Now, of course, this is all premised on the assumption, and it's a very uncertain assumption, but I'm going to use it anyways, that Hamas is going to be toppled. Because short of that, we're in a completely different environment. If Hamas wins, if Hamas can emerge, and winning for Hamas is simply survival. If Hamas can emerge and say, you know what we did on October 7th and we survived, this will have ripple effects beyond the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This will send a message to every terror organization and their mastermind in Tehran, Iran. Basically, you can do something like this, and if you can hold fast, you'll get away with it. This will reshape, I think, the security landscape in the Middle East. Yet, assuming that Hamas is toppled, we're left with a problem. As we learned here from Iraq and Afghanistan, getting into a war is one thing, getting out of a war is totally different. Because when you go in a war of this kind, you don't want to leave and create a vacuum. Because one thing we learned in the Middle East, that vacuums are not filled by, Mother Teresa's and the lovey-dovey types. They're filled by the worst elements. So leaving a vacuum is not really an option. Yet the other options are also not very appealing. Israel staying there is something that most Israelis that I know would just not want. Israel left in 2005 for a reason, and most Israelis don't want to do it. Yes, there are those, including in the cabinet, who want to resettle Israel. My sense is that they are a minority in the Israeli body politic. The obvious answer would be for the Palestinian Authority to come and govern. Yet the Palestinian Authority is too weak and too discredited because of all of the reasons that I mentioned before, that this is simply not an option. So the option that today everyone is focusing on is to bring a third party to come and govern Gaza, at least for an interim period. And this third party should be composed primarily of Arab forces and Arab personnel, but definitely with an international body or international kind of umbrella to give it a sense of legitimacy. Yet this is also very complicated. It's complicated for a number of reasons. Some are political, some are security. Any country that, and I've heard this from senior Arab officials, whether it's the Gulf or Egypt or Jordan, they would tell you will not even consider this unless there are two conditions met. The first condition, Israel has to recommit to a two-state solution, and this should be seen as part of a two-state solution. For those Arab countries, they cannot justify politically coming and running Gaza without at least having this aspirational objective of getting a two-state solution. Everyone knows this is not an option in the short term, but they have to frame it as part of reaching that. But also, they say that our presence should be temporary, and we should work, as we work on reconstructing Gaza, we have to work on reforming the Palestinian Authority to ultimately have the Palestinian Authority come in. Both objectives are rejected by the current Israeli government. Bibi came out, Benjamin Netanyahu, very clearly saying, we are not interested in this. So this leaves us with diplomatic and political stalemate. I'm not too worried about it, by the way, because this is positioning, and as time goes, I think a middle ground will be found. What is more complicated is the security situation, because ultimately, governing Gaza requires someone to come and create a security presence there. Yet Israel is saying clearly and maybe understandably that, look, we're not going to cede our security to anyone else, and we will continue having overriding security control. And as I heard from an intelligence officer in some Arab country that's candidate to be part of this, he said to me, what do you want us to do? To come in and what? When the Israelis come in, we stand down and look like collaborators? That's not good for us politically. Or do you want us to go and stand and confront the Israelis and basically end up with a war on Israel? And that's not something we're interested in. So today, really, the big question that is on everyone's mind, whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Riyadh, whether it's in Cairo, is what do you do the day after? My own sense is that we will need a transitional period in which Israel will govern, but the sooner that we start at least reconfiguring the political outlook and get Israel to ultimately recommit to an ultimate two-state solution and make sure that whatever we do the day after is not only about rebuilding Gaza, but also about reforming and rebuilding the Palestinian Authority. Unless we do that, I'm afraid we'll be in a situation where Israel will be stuck in Gaza, and all that Israel tried to do in 2005 will be reversed. This will not be good for Israel itself, in my view, but who am I to speak about Israel? Certainly will not be good for the Palestinians, and I would argue will be very bad for the prospects of further regional integration of Israel as even the Abraham Accord countries will find it difficult to deal with the current reality, and it'll be very hard to imagine how we can bring other countries into this. With this, I think I'm going to conclude. Thank you very much. One last comment I would say. Look, David and I have been doing this for many, many years, and when you do this, you develop very thick skin. So no question is off limits. Any question that you're on your mind, put it out there. I would rather we deal with controversial issues that rather than let them fester. With this, thank you very much and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. There's one thing I don't, this is not to rebut at all.
Rebut.
No, no. No, there's one thing that I feel that is part of the puzzle that needs to just be said. Like, why now? Why is Hamas doing this now? Like, they've been preparing for this for a long time. You could say, well, if they want to annihilate Israel, well, you know, now's as good as any time, right? That's fair. But I think there are two developments, and one of them is regional, that Ghaith just alluded to. But one was that Israel has, many of you who follow Israel knows that Israel has gone through a very tumultuous period in 2023 with this judicial overhaul, which a lot of the people in the opposition in Israel thought was a way to move Israel away from its moorings as a liberal democracy to being, yes, democratic, but maybe not as focused on the role of the courts, and would have serious consequences for Israel's character, for Israel's identity. And you had pilots in Israel saying they weren't going to fly, go to reserve duty. You had, people saying they wouldn't show up for reserve duty in special forces. Unheard of. 75 years of Israel, we've never seen such a thing. And I think the Arabs and the Iranians learned the wrong lesson. I think they thought Israel was a divided country. It's never been weaker. Nasrallah made comments, this is the time, Israel's weak. We need to join hands. And we saw, meetings of the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas. I think they felt there was this axis of resistance that was going to somehow magically unite and pounce and exploit the weakness of Israel. And I think they got it all wrong, because one thing about Israel is that when Israel feels threatened from the outside, it unites internally. And Israel's more cohesive. And the very people who said they weren't going to go to reserve duty, all those pilots are flying. And a group called Achim Laneshek, Brothers in Arms, the people who said they wouldn't go to reserve duty, they were the ones driving people to their reserve units to show up. They had over 100% fulfillment in these reserve units. You've had a 360,000 reservists being called up. So I think that it backfired. I think the other development that was important, and this might sound to you a little somewhat abstract, but I think it's really important to understand. Ghaith mentioned regional integration, the Abraham Accords, and that is something the Biden administration has been trying to do, where that's something that the Saudis very much want, the Israelis very much want, and the US very much wants. And that was to see, would it be possible to pull off what I call a mega deal, a deal to end all deals, so to speak, that was going to be a super duper Abraham Accords. If the Abraham Accords brought peace between Israel and the UAE and Morocco and Bahrain, here you'd be taking the most powerful, the wealthiest, the largest geographically based state in the Middle East called Saudi Arabia. And you would say, okay, this is going to be a 2-for-1. There's going to be a Saudi defense treaty of Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis feel they're not in a NATO. If Russia hits Germany, the US goes to war for Germany. But if Iran hits up Arabia, who's going to go to war for Saudi Arabia? And I think they were spooked by in 2019 when Iran used cruise missiles to hit a key oil production facility of Aramco. That was one of the largest, and the US didn't act. So the US said, we want it in American law, just like you have a treaty with Japan in 1960. 2/3 of the Senate, we want 2/3 of the Senate to say we will defend Saudi Arabia. But they said, well, 2/3 of the Senate is both parties, it's Democrats and Republicans, there's never just one. And they said, we're willing to do peace with Israel. And that was like, whoa, you just put a lot on the table. Saudi-Israeli peace. that's the Super Bowl, that's the back to sports, that's the World Series, that's the World Cup, all wrapped together. And I think if for Hamas and maybe at Hezbollah too, and Iran, this was like a huge threat. It would be like game over. It would be if you had peace. Israel already has it with Egypt, the most important Arab country on its borders that have fought wars within 48, 56, 67, 73. Jordan, the country that has the longest border with Israel. And you got the UAE, the second wealthiest, but now you have the wealthiest Arab state saying, enough, peace, peace, peace. I think that really spooked Hamas to say, whatever happens, this cannot be allowed to happen, because then we become irrelevant. And so I wonder if, and everyone I know at the White House, at the State Department, in Israel, in the Arab world, they talk to diplomats, they all believe this. That Hamas thought, if we'll do something so outrageous, there's not going to be anyone in the United States that can defend this. But if we do something so outrageous, it will force an Israeli retaliation, and that retaliation is going to be really big, that it will fill every Arab satellite television channel, every TV set in Saudi Arabia, and it will constrain the Saudis from acting. That sounds to you like a 3-cushion shot in billiards, I realize, but I truly believe the fear of a Saudi US-Israel mega deal was a key component in terms of the timing of what Hamas did. And by the way, just as a postscript, the second front of the axis of resistance with Hezbollah has not opened up. At the end of the day, Nasrallah said, hey man, you did this for your own reasons. You didn't ask us. Now, why, and I think what changed it, we have a colleague, Hanin Radar, who follows Hezbollah, follows social media in the Shia world of Lebanon. And she said at the beginning, on WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal and all these things, they were all like, come on, we got to join the axis of resistance. But then the US sent aircraft carriers off the coast of Lebanon. And somebody go, okay, you're on your own. Okay, you didn't ask us beforehand. And basically the Iranians see us as Hezbollah, they see us as an insurance policy against, if Israel hits the Iranian nuclear program, we're supposed to hit Israel. Nowhere does it say in our contract that we're supposed to come to Hamas's aid. So I think the second front has not materialized yet. Now you can say the war isn't over, let's see, let's wait, fair enough. But I don't think when we've seen Hamas spokesmen on Arab satellite television, they say a few things. One is we'll do it all over again. We do October 7th again, which is so ghastly. But they also say we're disappointed that Hezbollah has not joined an axis of resistance. We thought it would. So anyway, I just think these regional pieces here are worth filling out the picture for you. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to keep it briefly then. Well, first of all, I was thinking of a few things to start speaking about, and I was thinking about, okay, let's frame it from the global to the individual. Maybe that will be a little bit more clear like this, because obviously those issues are very complex, and for some reason, I still have to, maybe you can answer better than I can. Everybody feels like the experts, except the experts. So if you're an expert, you say, oh, you know what, I'm going to be modest about it, and then you're going to try to explain it. Everybody else, oh, talk to me, I know how to deal with it. So, and that relates to that to the first question, which is more about the global perspective, which is Barack Obama was already talking about the global liberal order and the benefits it has from the post-Cold War and the benefits it has in the world, which everybody can understand that, okay, I want my mother to live in peace and prosperity. And obviously, if my mother will, then my neighbor's mother also lives in peace and safety, then we all can prosper and live happily ever after. So that kind of fostering agreements in the world was very successful. And we know so many indices, so much information and research that was done. We are living in one of the most peaceful time ever recorded in human history. So this idea of self-interest sharing, is quite successful post-Cold War. Why, for some reason, it's not very successful in this specific conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Okay, let me take a shot at this, and I actually want to zoom out. I mean, since you want to talk big and small, then go small. I want to say actually, before this happened, and this kind of dovetails to what David was saying, we started seeing some very interesting changes in the Arab world. I mean, any of you who studies Arab politics in the 20th century will know that the definition of Arab politics in most of the 20th century, and that's throughout, from the Gulf all the way to Morocco, was all about sloganeering and ideology. If you look at what motivated Arab politics much of that period, is these transnational political trends, pan-Arabism, socialism, Islamism, with all of its kind of things. And all of those have basically failed. Pan-Arabism really failed with the death of Nasser in the 1970s or the 70s. Islamism has failed with the socialism failed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Islamism really failed with the Arab Spring. And so what we started seeing after the Arab Spring, the Arab world really splitting into two camps. One camp that still hung, stuck to those old paradigms. Countries like, I would argue, Algeria, I would argue countries like Qatar, etc., that continue to basically try to get legitimacy through very heightened rhetoric. And in this worldview, the issue of Israel-Palestine is probably the biggest rallying cry. If you're an Islamist, it's those infidel Jews are coming and taking our lands. If you're a pan-Arabist, then this non-Arab entity is coming in our midst. If you're a socialist or anti-colonialist, or the settler colonial country is there. So this basically, Israel-Palestine provided good fodder for all of these ideologies. And we still see them in some parts of the Arab world. Again, Syria, Algeria, Lebanon, to some extent, etc. Yet something else started happening in the Arab world. We started seeing some governments basically saying, wait a minute, maybe I should reconfigure my concept of how do I get legitimacy. Rather than fiery speeches, let me start delivering. We started seeing this, interestingly, in the Gulf. United Arab Emirates was the trailblazer. This is what is happening today in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman. And those guys are saying, look, we're not interested in democracy. We're not going to be Democrats. That's not what we want to do. Yet we believe that the consent of the government can be achieved in other ways. And these ways are, provide personal security for your citizens, prosperity, a non-corrupt government, a responsive government. And this way, you will get the majority of the people on your side. As actually a Gulf official told me a few years ago. Now, he said, look, what do people want? Security, prosperity, etc. We'll give them all of this. You'll end up with having this 0.1% who want political freedom. Great, we'll put them in jail. And who will come out in their support? No one. And this is the model that they're doing. Now, within all of this, we're starting to see this split in these two different narratives. And I believe, and here I agree with David, part of what Hamas did, and again, Hamas is part of a wider network, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood network or it's the pro-Iranian network. They did that as a way of countering this new wave of changing the way you do politics and governance. So, I wouldn't be too, how shall I say it, unkind to Obama. I think the trend lines were going in that direction. One thing we've learned from history, every time you see the beginnings of a change, certainly a peaceful change, every actor who benefited from the status quo ante will do everything they can against it. And Hamas is certainly a movement that benefited from the continuation of the conflict and will do everything that it could to basically torpedo that.
Another question about that, about the issues of, Eva Eagles wrote an article recently, precisely talking about this factor and the ongoing movement and support in general, in the US, in Europe, in many countries, of course, other than the Arabic world, which is, I think you can call like in the Ummah, no? The idea of the nationhood of Arabic, which that is a thing by itself. But Evangelos was referring more to the global left. And if there's anything in Israel now that the left in Israel is feeling, is this disillusion from the global left. It's like being left aside, saying like, what had happened here? And it seems like somehow this global left like failed morally and intellectually the people in Israel. So how do you explain that part?
Well, look, I'll start maybe on this one. My understanding of like, you have a theory in social sciences, of the intersectionality that somehow tries to divide the world between oppressor and oppressed. And, I think reality is so much more complex, because that intersectionality theory is, how does that fit with history? How does it fit with socioeconomics, demographics, governance? I mean, Israel would certainly see itself as the underdog in a regional struggle that doesn't accept it, in different parts of the Arab world. But yet in other contexts, it's viewed as, the stronger one. The reality is complicated. And I just think that it's really unfair to try to, also Israel, most of its population is Sephardic, are Jews from Middle Eastern countries. And yet it's seen as, by some of these theorists as like, oh, they're a white country. Most of it isn't. Or, for example, someone on the global left will say, these are settler colonialists. I mean, the Jews are indigenous. They've been there for thousands of years. They've been the majority in Jerusalem, certainly since 1840. And so all these categorizations, I think, are really unfair to the truth. And where Rafe and I are coming from is that we think both of these sides might have a sense of, claiming they have justice on their side. But there's just too much history, too little geography, and they're going to have to compromise with two states. And so, to portray Israel as the villain is utterly unfair, given Israel's connection to this land. And Palestinians would say, listen, we know the Jews have a connection to the land. I mean, this conflict would be in a completely different place. And Israelis, say Palestinians have a connection to the land. I think it's easier for Israelis to say that, but I mean, each one will make their own decisions. The point is, there's just, like I said, geography is very stubborn. You can't choose your neighbors. You're gonna have to find ways as to compromise. Each time you say, I have a right to this, I have a right to this, but doesn't mean that's always the wise thing to exercise every right. So we're coming at it from a position that that each side has a legitimate argument. But I think some of the progressive left, I'm sorry to say this, because some of them just think Israel doesn't have any rights. They're not entitled to their rights. They're somehow colonialist. And that's just the farthest thing from the truth in terms of the history. And each one has these just claims, but if there's no compromise, you could keep killing each other for the most just of reasons. It doesn't help. So that's why Rafe and I come and speak, is because we feel there's a lot of, heat on this issue. We want to bring a little bit of light. We feel that there needs to be compromise. But to portray Israel as if it's some sort of an alien force is outrageous, given Israel's historical connection. And the Palestinians have a historical connection too. So there's no alternative but to compromise.
Just a couple of additions, and I agree with everything you said, David. One is, look, the amount of the civilian casualties and the human aspect of it is, such that it's only normal that some people have some sympathy. So, one has to factor this in. But one point to where you started the Q&A is I often find people who join in some of these activities to actually not know what they're talking about. I mean, I met this young woman who a relative of mine with not a single bit of Middle Eastern blood in her, went to one of these demonstrations and was chanting from the river to the sea. And I was like, do you actually understand what this means? And actually walked her through what it means. And she's like, oh. So many people, I mean, often we assume that people who take a certain position come at it from a place of malice. And certainly some people do. But I think many people come at it from a place of ignorance. And this is where, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, this is a free country and everyone can believe what they want to believe. But I think if your belief is not based on actually knowing the complexities of this issue, no one should be expected to become a deep expert, but at least to get the basic knowledge. I fear that often the activism ends up in a way that might make you feel good about yourself, but really not helping neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians, because it prolongs the conflict. And the only way that you can, you know, end this tragedy is to find a way of ending this conflict.
And we're running out of time, so I just want to I will connect 3 points into one question. So it's going to be a little bit loaded question. One, which related to this, starting with the idea of justice and peace, which we know that cannot coincide or coexist with peace. We have to make some sort of I mean, if you look at many parts of the world at the moment, there's peace because it was the minute where somebody said, okay, we're not going to have the justice we feel and we want to have. If you look at even from Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, not long ago it was Poland. And Poland decided, okay, we're going to give it up. And if you look at Ecuador and Peru, there was the whole part of the Amazonia said, okay, you know what, you're too strong for us, we don't want to fight, we're going to lose, so might as well. And even Israel did that, like you explained very well, with Sinai and with Gaza and with different places. So my thought of well, actually, I will continue with the next phase of the actual question, also about, so if we talk about justice and peace, we see now the Gazans that are very into justice, and also that's the cry from a lot of the manifestations, the demonstrations that are going along, the search for justice. Now the thing is like this: those people, those terrorists, I mean the terrorists because they look for terror, and not militant and not military people. The terrorists of Hamas that came and did in October 7, those homes, and they were educated somewhere. And I did my master's degree, I did the research about UNRWA, and I wanted to see your take about it. So many people have a lot of very valid criticism of the UN. Well, the biggest criticism that I have on that specific area is about UNRWA with having 288 schools. And according to them, they say that this is the third biggest school provider for Gaza, which will be something like in the US term after New York and LA, that will be UNRWA. So many of them were educated because 91% of the Gazans go to school from 6 to 12. So they were educated over there. So what role is the UN have in perpetuating this idea of justice in this neighborhoods?
Let me start. All right, let me start with the easy one, justice. Look, I'm a lawyer by training and a diplomat by profession, so justice is an alien concept to me. Because, you know, to be serious for a minute, you know, for me, justice is too abstract of a term to actually mean anything. In the sense that, of course, there are cases when justice is clear. You know, in apartheid South Africa, justice was very clear. You know, when it comes to the Holocaust, issues of justice were very clear. Yet in most cases, justice is very subjective. And let me look, for example, at 1948, you know, the genesis of this whole conflict. And try to understand what justice means when it comes to that year. That year for me will always be a tragic year. For me, it will always be a Nakba, mean the catastrophe. For me, it's a year in which 800,000 of my people were displaced, and a year in which we lost 70-some% of our historic land, and no amount of anything will make me celebrate 1948. That's what it is for me. And in the same way, when for Israelis, 1948 was obviously a glorious year. It's the year that the diaspora has ended. It's the year that the Jews will no longer be vulnerable and subject to someone else's will. Both are statements that I think are valid, both in fact and in terms of portraying justice from the perspective of those who want it. If we ever gonna try to get to a common understanding of 1948, this will entail one of the two sides giving up a core aspect of their identity, and to my mind, that's never just. So, in certain things, when it comes to history, when it comes to this, we have to agree to disagree, and rather than trying to get to force the other side to adopt our narrative, the most that we can do is to at least accept that when an Israeli says to me, 1948 was a good year, I have to understand that she's not coming from a place of malice, trying to kind of rub my nose in it, as it were. And when I say 1948 was a tragic year, I don't say it to mean that Israel is not legitimate. I'm just expressing my own interest. So to me, justice is too abstract a concept to lead to any meaningful policy issues. When it comes to the UN and UNRWA, sure, I can. My wife worked for the UN for a while, for WHO, so I can tell you all about the waste and the poor management and all of these things that relate to the UN system. Yet, I do believe that the UN, particularly UNRWA, fills a very important role in certainly in Gaza, and I would argue larger. As you said, it's one of the biggest providers of health, education, etc. It is not a coincidence that Israel, which could have easily kicked UNRWA out of Gaza and the West Bank. Remember, Israel wasn't controlled from 1967 and Gaza until 2005. So they could have done that. Israel kept it, and until now, Israel wants it to stay. Why? Because it's actually doing a service. If you remove UNRWA, you end up with a huge, huge vacuum that no one can fill. I don't want to even speak about if you remove UNRWA from Jordan, that would create major instability in that country, and it's no one's interest to destabilize Jordan. So, you know, it's the UN is imperfect, yet it fills a vacuum that someone needs to fill, and that's why everyone complains about the UN, but everyone wants it to stay. When it comes to the education, you know, of course, I want to see a more inclusive education. And by the way, the issue of accepting Israel is just one of many. I want an education system that is less misogynistic. I want an education system that is more accepting of other ways of being, etc., which certainly the Palestinian education system is not. But I don't believe that if you remove UNRWA tomorrow, suddenly the Palestinians will forget about their national aspirations, etc. To think that the national aspirations are simply kept alive by UNRWA, I think, is oversimplification. Palestinians, we're a nation, we have our own vision, our own sense of ourselves, and our own aspirations. And it's not fed by UNRWA, it's fed by us, and it's kept by us. So remove UNRWA, you create instability, but I'm not sure you're going to do anything to de-radicalize.
I would just add on this, just for those of you who don't know what UNRWA is, about the UN Relief and Welfare Agency, UNRWA, and why is it so controversial? You know, and I just to fill in for those who are not as knowledgeable, I think certainly the Israeli critique of UNRWA is, look, the UN has a thing called the High Commissioner on Refugees, which in every other part of the world, the job is, hey, you're a refugee here, I can find you a place there. And it's very problem-solving oriented. But there's only one people that the UN has carved out a separate agency for, and that is the Palestinians, to say, hey, I'm not out to solve your individual problems, saying, hey, you're a refugee, I'm going to find you a place in Canada or in Dubai. I'm going to create a framework where you're going to stay, you know, where you are. And by the way, that is, as Ghaith said correctly, you know, they also have UNRWA camps in Jordan and Lebanon, because a lot of the Palestinian refugees are there. What drives the Israelis crazy about UNRWA is multiple things. And even though we might end up in the same place, I think it's important for this audience to understand, as I try to unpack the question, why Israel, you know, UNRWA drives Israel up a wall. Because they say, hey, you know, one, your job of the UN is to solve refugee problems, not perpetuate them. And that there are people who have been dead for years, and yet they're still on the UNRWA rolls as refugees. So there's this question of, are you perpetuating the problem? Second, so it's tied into the whole refugee issue. Is this a problem to be solved or a cause to be perpetuated? That's one cluster. There's another cluster that runs about the educational system of their institutions. And Ghaith is right. Look, I went to the guy who was the chief of staff of the Israeli military. I asked him very simple. I said, tell me, from where you're sitting, do you want to see UNRWA gone in terms of the school system? And he said, me? Yeah, ideally, of course, but I judge everything by what are the alternatives? What if there was no UNRWA? They would go to Hamas schools, or they'd be in no school. And to have 400,000 Gazan kids on the streets, that's a security risk. And I think the UNRWA education, they could say it's a very low bar, right? The Hamas education, but is that like, I'd rather have them in a UN school, which ostensibly is trying to talk about pluralism and things like that, and democracy and all those things. So every decision is a function of your options. You know, that's basically where this chief of staff of the Israeli military came down. So the second cluster of objections is on education. And the third cluster is who is really on the, I mean, there's always corruption issues, as you mentioned, right? But I think that's a lot of it is our local Palestinians exploiting the facilities of UNRWA to hide weapons, which the UNRWA policy is to say we have no tolerance for this. But yet a lot of the employees are not the overseas employees coming from New York and Scandinavia and all that, and Australia. It's based on local employees that might have a more, you know, utilitarian view of UNRWA, which is this is a place we're going to try to store weapons to keep them away from Israel. These are three separate points, but I do think, I guess I land where the chief of staff of the Israeli military lands is this ideal? No. But what are the alternatives right now? And to be fair to UNRWA, and we just had a session with the head of UNRWA in the southern part of Gaza, they are doing the sheltering for these million people that are coming from the north. There's not a lot of people that are volunteering. Yes, there's a field hospital of Jordan or the UAE. That's nice. But 1 million people to shelter them in facilities, you've got like 149 facilities, mostly in the south. That's a big task. So are they perfect? No. Should the whole charter of the thing be totally reformulated? Yes. But given your alternatives, I think this crisis shows it's better that they exist for all their flaws than not existing at all, because that vacuum would just be filled by Hamas.
Oh, no, if we talk about refugees, not about education. But just, I'm going to be like Rolling Stone. I must say the last one, but I'm going to have another. So it's just because it is very interesting. It's something that recently said Ilya Sutskever, one of the founding thinkers of OpenAI. He's the head of that company. He recently said that he envisioned a world where humanity is a collection of world governors that will be a democratic board members of the company, and the AGI, the artificial general intelligence, as the CEO. So the question is, can you see a future where we relinquish the control of the peace talk to an AI and we accept whatever reality it decides?
Absolutely not. First of all, I'll be out of a job, and that's not good. But more importantly, I think we forget that politics and leadership is not about management. It is about empathy. It is about risk-taking. It's about how do you generate support of your public. It's about how do you speak to your public. None of these things I see AI being able to do. And if it does it, that's my definition of post-apocalyptic dystopia.
Yeah, I would also look where it comes to, look, I wrote a book with Dennis Ross on, I wrote one book on Oslo on the decision making, and as you pointed out, I've co-written two. One is about leadership. There's just no alternative for leadership, and leadership is that intimate relationship that a leader has with their publics to make tough decisions. No machine can say this is the magic answer. It's about me being, as a leader, being persuade you this is good for you, or you persuading the leader, he's on the wrong course, we're getting a new leader. But this is, and everyone's going to have their own narrative. There's no magic narrative that's going to say, no, the Palestinian narrative on 48 is this way, the Israeli era is like this. It's all part of their identity. And somehow the people who are going to find a way to make this compromise, that they live together, I think it's going to be leaders that have credibility with their own people, who say, this is a calculated risk, not a reckless risk. These are all the benefits that would accrue to you. And this is how we perpetuate our identity, not how we erase our identity. There's no world government here. I just don't believe in that. I mean, I know there were people at the end of World War II who thought the UN would turn out to be a world government. And that turned out not to be true, because national identity is meaningful. And that's why we come back to two states, because ultimately, we don't see either of these countries basically saying, oh, you know what? We were wrong. Zionism is fantastic. Or we were wrong, and Palestine is the way to go. The Jews who go there and Israel, they did this because they saw this as central to their core identity, that defenseless, stateless Jews are defenseless Jews. And they want to be in a Jewish state. They want that for their holidays. They want that for their language. They want it for their identity. They want this to be the rhythm of the life they lead. And the Palestinians want the same. And we're not going to be able to erase those identities. And so that's why leadership is required. And AI is going to do fantastic things, we hope, and not blow up the world, we hope. But I wouldn't subcontract it to solve this conflict.
Thank you. Well, we stretched the patience of the public enough. So if you have any questions, now is the time.
Could you say also like where you're from, what are you studying, what year you are and stuff?
My name is Anya. I'm from Washington, D.C.
One of us. Yeah.
And I'm majoring in science and minoring in sociology. And I feel like everything I see like on Instagram is just something like such an extreme narrative. And I've been like struggling to understand what's the actual history. So I was wondering if you have any recommendations about like books or any sources are like as least biased as possible.
Actually, I would recommend the book written by a couple of friends of ours. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's actually 3 authors: an Israeli, Shai Cohen, a Palestinian, Hillel International, and an Egyptian, Abdel Said. And they did a really interesting thing. They just basically did the history of the conflict from 3 perspectives. So on every page of that book, there's one column says, 1948. This is how the Israelis saw it. This is how the Palestinians saw it. This is how the Arabs saw it. The 3 of them are actually very serious academics. These are not amateurs. And I still find that to be kind of the best introduction to how each of the 3 sides see it. They're not trying to make judgment on the other side. They're just putting their narrative the way it is.
Yeah, I would look.
Here, I'll look it up while you give your
you look it up. It's called Arabs and Israelis: Conflict and Peacemaking in the Middle East. Actually, I actually assigned the book in the class I teach at Johns Hopkins. I was afraid I was going to mess up the title, but look, I also think a good single volume on the Israel piece is Daniel Gordis' Israel Reborn. Is a good single volume. I would hope you look at the work that Dennis Ross and I did on 4 leaders who made big historic decisions. It's called Be Strong Enough, Good Courage. I would hope on a daily basis, if you have time to say, like, where can I get good information? I would be very wary, as I said before, of Al Jazeera, or, I also don't think Israel-Hamas is on the right, and Israel is necessarily the only thing to look at. I do think the Times of Israel is very good on a daily basis. I would hope you would look at our thing, the Washington Institute. We were putting out analysis pieces every day. We got 26 people analyzing things from every which angle of the Middle East. Both of us try to be on social media. I'm on @David Makovsky on X, used to call it Twitter. And even though I don't know how to use it, I have everything I put on Instagram now. David.Makovsky. Then I hope, but my goal is not to bombard people with articles. It's to try to find out here are 3 or 4 major points of the day that would hopefully, I don't know, illuminate, clarify kind of what are the main things to be supportive of. I think the daily stuff, I know you didn't ask about daily per se, but I do think we get this on campuses wherever we go, is the importance of, I mean, I think the Times of Israel is very good. There's also Arabiya and Arabic, like you
In English, no, it has an English website, in Arabiya, which I find to be more centrist in its approach. By the way, if you want Al-Arabiya, and if you're looking for go in depth into Palestinian history, I would look at, you know, I'm reluctant because I disagree with this guy's politics, but I think he did some good research. Rashid Al-Khalidi, his book is called, you know, easily enough, Palestinian Nationalism. So it can it traces back the origin of Palestinian nationalism from the beginning. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. I have a question real quickly. You said that like the solution would be compromise. If you like maybe kind of describe what that would look like.
Yeah, sure. Just go back here.
Not vaguely, you're gonna get the
Yeah, no, I know. Look, basically, right, this is the West Bank. Right here. And there's Gaza here. And basically, and Jerusalem was right at the edge here. So I think for the most part, it's gonna be some solution. And again, Ghaith knows because I have a whole website devoted to this issue called Settlements and Solutions. Most of the Israelis who do live in the West Bank live in 8% of the land closest to what we call the Green Line. The Green Line is this area along the West Bank. And they live close to that line. And it's about, you know, I don't know, about 450,000 basically are there. And I would say of that amount, about 350,000 live in that 8% of the area near the Green Line, and what we call settlement blocks that are within what's called the barrier. The barrier is along very close to the Green Line, but not precisely. It's in that 8%. And then Israel would yield 92%. 8 plus 92 is 100%, right? And then would offset that 8% with land exchanges, what we call swaps, land exchanges. Say here, okay, I'm going to keep 8% of the West Bank, but I'm going to find you another 8% within Israel, which is not, there's not endless amounts of land that are adjacent to the West Bank. There's area here, and there's an area right up here. There is, you could get maybe up to close to 8%. So it's hard, but the idea is that the Palestinians could say, I got 100%. I net out at 100%. You gave Sadat of Egypt the whole Sinai, not 92% of Sinai. You got 100% of Sinai. I want what Sadat got, 100% of the West Bank. So I think the land exchange idea is a creative concept to try to say, most of the settlers stay where they are. That 85% of the settlers who live in 8% of the land, but there'll be territorial offsets. And so I'm sorry it gets a little technical that way, but the idea is, look, I want to be fair and blunt. Is the Israeli public is traumatized right now because of what happened, and I think what Ghaith said before is so true. It's one thing to say this is going to be aspirational. You want to work towards this compromise, I think, along the lines that I said, which I think most people know the compromises, know that's the way to do it. Give or take a percentage here, percentage there. But I don't think you can implement this tomorrow morning because the Israeli public is very traumatized by all these massacres of October 7th. And it's not just that, it's that the West Bank Palestinian Authority, which is there now in Ramallah, in the West Bank, right near Jerusalem. Here's Ramallah, it's right here. Bethlehem is here. Hebron is here. Nablus, Tulkarm. So they've got some problems that they would admit. I mean, Ghaith is tougher on them than I. He'll say they're thieves. That's corrupt. That's that simple. And he's right. They are corrupt, and they're but they're not ready for prime time yet. You know what I'm saying? Like, they're not ready to go. They said, state solution, can you do it tomorrow morning? The answer is no, they can't, because they're not ready. And this issue about what Ray spoke earlier about the day after in Gaza, I mean, you're going to need a big consortium of Arab countries and others, internationals, to come in and deal with reconstruction. It's going to take time. This is a goal to reach towards, but not something to be done tomorrow, because the trauma is deep, and there's a lot of people saying, look, I just don't want to see another Arab. I can't handle it. And someone say, well, actually 2 states is better for those people because it's separation, it's a divorce. They'll have their state over there. You'll be over here. You won't see each other, but first of all, 20% of Israel is Arab, apart from the Palestinians. That's a separate group. Okay, so there's, let's say, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, another close to 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. That's 5 million. Then there's 2 million Israeli Arabs. Now, ironically, October 7th, according to polling data I've seen, which is amazing, it's startling, it's astonishing to anyone who follows this stuff, actually 70% of Israeli Arabs said, I've identified with the state. It's like, I don't want to live under Hamas. Do you want to live under Hamas? It's like, no, I'm an Israeli Arab. So there's a lot of, it would be interesting to see how this thing plays out. I do think 2 states is the one thing, is a divorce. It's not a marriage. It gives everyone their own country. And I think that's still a worthy goal to work towards, but because of the malfeasance and all the problems, I don't think it's good. This compromise that I'm outlining is going to happen tomorrow morning. So I want to just put it in perspective.
I mean, very quick reactions just to what David said. I mean, and David is right. I mean, this is a generational issue, maybe, but all of us, certainly all of us who were involved in negotiations, and David was a negotiator for the Americans, I was a negotiator for the Palestinians. We do know what the contours are, and as David said, they are basically what you see there. In the dark is going to be a Palestinian state, and the light is going to be Israel. The problem is a lot of these decisions that need to be taken are very difficult decisions, because ultimately, in addition to what David said, for a peace deal to happen, in my view, Israel has to accept the division of Jerusalem, which is a very, very heavy lift for any Israeli leader. And the Palestinians will have to give up what we call the right of return, i.e. those 700,000 and their descendants who were displaced in the 48 will not go back to their original homes. Now, the problem is not in finding the solutions, it's in finding the leaders who have the political strength to go to the public and say, you know what, we have to make these kind of compromises. Usually strong leaders can make difficult decisions, weak leaders cannot. And on both sides today, we see weak leaders. We see in Israel, as you said, Israel before this was split halfway in terms of their support for the prime minister. In the Palestinian case, it's even much worse. So that's one. To what you said, David, in the same way that Israelis don't want to see Palestinians, the feeling is mutual. And in the same way that for many Israelis, they will tell you all of the bad things the Palestinians did. The Palestinians have their own narrative, the expansion of settlements and settler violence and all that kind of stuff. I think one of the biggest casualties of the violence, not only of what's happening now, even though what's happening now is deepening it, but really since the early 2000s, is both peoples have lost faith on having a partner on the other side. Again, my generation, I remember very well when I moved to Ramallah and, had Israeli partners, because we were moving towards peace, and I could easily go to my public and say, look, we have Israelis that we can do business with, because my people saw it in the same way that the Israelis saw it. Partnership worked. Today, you have a generation that has seen nothing but the worst that the other side has to offer. Violence, occupation, terror, etc. So I think, while I totally agree with David that having a two-state solution is not possible now because of the mutual mistrust and because of the lack of strong leaders on either side, I do believe that we have to start looking for small ways of rehabilitating the idea of cooperation. There are many ways, there are many common interests and common threats facing both nations. Talk about climate change, for example. In that region, climate change is not tomorrow's problem, it's today's problem. There are serious issues related to climate change. That's an amazing area where you can find cooperation. Look at public health. At the end of the day, COVID did not stop at one border or another. So there's a lot of these kind of threats that you can work together. And there are always also ways of finding small ways of cooperating that can validate the idea of cooperation per se. This will not resolve the conflict. You need the major compromise to resolve the conflict, but at least we need to prove to Palestinians that they have Israeli partners and to Israelis that they have Palestinian partners. One last quick point here. One thing that's going really below the radar for years now was, Palestinian and Israeli security forces, since the end of the Intifada, I would say 06, 07, have started working very closely together. And today, and you find this may be counterintuitive, in Israel, the biggest advocates for Palestinian interests are the Israeli military and intelligence folks, and the flip is true. On the Palestinian side, it's the same. It's not like those guys suddenly became, loving, fuzzy, kind of tree-hugging types, but they understood that they have someone on the other side that they can do business with and they can trust. And we have to find ways of basically scaling this from one sector, and that security, into other sectors, to start creating a sense of possibility. And once you have that, it becomes easier to deal with the issues of politics.
I would just, one last point. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog. I would just say this, look, what you want people to feel is that they withdraw from land, they're more secure, they're not more vulnerable. That's the most important thing. A leader's got to be able to look his people in the eye or her people in the eye and say, look, if you get out of this area, you're going to be more secure. Because that's all people want for their families, for their friends, for their kids, their grandparents. Is like, I'm told that if we do this, we're more secure. Israel pulls out of Lebanon in 2000, pulls out of Gaza in 2005, and gets rockets. So it's like, if you didn't like the book, I don't want to see the movie. That's the problem, part of the West Bank. Now, Ghaith is 1,000% right in what he says, is that it's the security establishments, ironically, that are the most pragmatic people on both sides. And we tend to see that up close, the two of us. And that's why we're always looking for the pragmatists that have the security credentials. Because if people don't feel secure, they're not going to want to keep doing this. And people say, well, Israel should have pulled out unilaterally from Lebanon. Hezbollah wasn't going to negotiate with Israel. They were stuck. Either they pulled out unilaterally or they'd be there to this day. And Gaza too here, and we could have a discussion, maybe I don't want to get into it, yes, but about how that could have been done differently in 2005. But all you need to do is, it's unfair to portray the Israeli right. I know you didn't do that. You just asked a very basic question about how do you find a compromise. Mm-hmm. But there's a fracturing on the right. You're going to have people on the right in Israel who believe this is biblical, and it's not just misguided, but it's illegitimate to yield biblical patrimony, right? That's going to be some people. But if you look at how Israel moved to the right, with the second Intifada and beyond, that was the second uprising between 2000, 2004 and beyond, it was people who were more liberal who became more conservative, who said, listen, man, they're blowing us up. Like, I want all this peace stuff. I think it's great. I'm all for it. Yeah, 2 states, that sounds cool. Why not? Let's do it. And then when the bombs started coming, they felt that there's no partner. And we could get into the details on all that. And how that was done and what was done. But you just need people to feel if you withdraw, you're secure, that they're safer that way. That's what, and leadership has to be able to do that in a credible way.
Thank you. So I think we have time to maybe one other question.
So this woman,
yeah, actually, why don't we combine the 2 questions?
Yeah, let's have the series of questions.
And also tell us where you're from.
Oh, okay. I'm from Dallas, Texas. I'm majoring. Wait, are you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm majoring in marketing and I'm minoring in Spanish. I just have a quick question, kind of going off of what Anya was saying. I've seen a lot of
biased views just circling around the ceasefire and like all of that that's going on. So can you kind of touch on a little bit of why some people would be for or against that and why? I know it's like currently going on as well, just a little bit.
That's good.
And
there another?
the lady had, you had the.
The idea of having outside authority governing Gaza, do you think having a temporary outside international governing or authority governing Gaza will create a precedent for other countries with internal conflicts? And what would be like the possible implications of that?
Both good questions.
Yeah. Do you wanna? Okay, brief, I mean, your question is actually briefer, simply because actually it won't create a precedent. It will build on existing precedents. We've seen in many conflicts in the past. Cambodia is one example, Bosnia is another example. You know, I can mention Aceh, East Timor. I mean, all of these, we've had this. So this is a model that actually exists. It's always complicated, but the precedent exists before. So that's, I mean, that's why this idea quickly caught on, because for most diplomats, it's something that we're very familiar with it just from observing other conflicts. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's less so. It's how you design it, and that's why we've been so much, many of us who advocate for this idea say, you need Arab states to be part of it, because the more that the participants are actually have a stake in the success, the more that you have longevity. If you have outsiders who have no stake in it, in the first crisis that happens, they pull out. But it's the precedent exists. Ceasefire. The arguments, you know, the argument for a ceasefire now is basically saying, look, the amount of civilian casualties and the amount of destruction of civilian infrastructure is such that it simply just does not justify the ultimate goal of destroying Hamas. So this is you know, it's basically saying this is just not worth it. Or some would even go and say the goal of destroying Hamas itself is illegitimate, and therefore you know, you have to end the fighting right now. So these are basically the voice for a ceasefire. And I have to say, I mean, I'm hearing it not only, I'm hearing it from some credible voices. So you have that one thing. The counter to it is basically saying, look, today, if you have a ceasefire and Hamas can emerge and say that we won by the virtue of surviving, then what you've done is you've sent you deprived Israel of its right to self-defense. Again, no country should accept being attacked this way. Two, you have set a precedent to other terrorist organizations in the region, and you've actually strengthened the Iranian access, and you've made the Iranian and other terror organizations in Yemen and Iraq and Syria more emboldened because they feel that they can get away with it. And frankly, as well, and this is where I'm coming from, would say that if you don't finish the job with Hamas, then they're setting Gaza up for the next round of fighting. The lesson that Hamas will learn from this is you can do it again and get away with it. Hamas is an organization that doesn't particularly care about the life of Palestinian civilians. I mean, one of their leaders was actually Musa al-Marzouk, the head of their external relations, was very blunt in saying, taking care of civilians is not our job. It's the job of the UN. And so, if you do it right now, if you do a ceasefire right now, it is a question. It is emboldening and strengthening Hamas, and basically they will emerge, and their narrative or their paradigm will be validated. So this is kind of the conceptual. In reality, as I think we both said. It's all about diplomatic pressure and a diplomatic space. A country like the US can go to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have all the time and space in the world because, you know, we are a superpower and we can basically, we have a veto power in the UN. Israel is a small country. And frankly, diplomatically, maybe militarily the strongest country in the region, diplomatically not a particularly strong country. And to the extent that it can show that it's conducting its military operation while minimizing civilian damage, the more that you can build the diplomatic support and create the diplomatic space. So this is kind of these are the for and against, but in reality, it's really about how much can one control the optics and how much can one minimize it in order to maintain that international coalition.
Yeah, but I just want to pick up what President Biden is trying to do is to thread this needle. That